The Sociology of Freedom. Manifesto of the Democratic Civilization. Volume 3. Written by Abdullah Öcalan. Society's urbanization problem. Madaniyya is another name for civilization, literally meaning urbanization in Arabic. There are more than a few problems stemming from urbanization, and they are no less important than the ecological problems. At present, urbanization is one of the fundamental threats to social life. What has made the city like this? Briefly, we could say that the formula city equals class equals state offers a simple explanation for the urbanization problem, but lacks depth and prevents flexible thinking. Humanity thought that cities, like villages, would suit the nature of society and went about building them. The city is a key site of concentrated social intelligence, provoking and revealing the intellectual ability of human beings. Reason has developed in a close relationship with the city. The city is where human beings began to recognize the breadth of their capacity. Cities also provide security. Those who are confident think more rationally. This development in thought resulted in new inventions. The city also developed methods and techniques for increasing production. The humans who experienced this saw the city as the source of light and always stretched towards it. Unsurprisingly, the city developed around the temple, because at the time, the temple was where sacred reason and spirit gathered, making it a site where society discovered and created its own reason and identity. What we are emphasizing here are the assumptions in favor of the city. As with everything, since its birth, there was another side to the city: class division and the formation of the state. The material base of class division, no doubt, was rising productivity. Some of those who possessed the city's developing reason learned from experience that an increase in the number of people working the fertile land would mean more people could be fed. Once this became clear, the challenge was to develop the necessary mechanism for achieving it. The mechanism that arose was the state, which is a sort of monopoly. This organization of a new order, albeit at the city level, clearly took the form of an agricultural monopoly. Sumerian cities make all of this clear. Many civilizations, including Egypt and Harappa, were agricultural monopolies at their birth and were the apparatus that organized production from the outset. When production reached a level at which there was a surplus product, at least twice that the existing population requires, the material basis for the state was in place. In fact, the state could be described as those who live off of surplus production. It might be more meaningful to call it an organization that amasses surplus, with the city the most suitable location for doing so, given that such relations were difficult to establish in tribal or village societies. Tribal and village structures simply did not allow for it. This is the basic reason that the state first arose in the city, and this is why humanity first encountered exploitation, a form of relationship previously unknown, in the city. The name of this new art was statism. Whoever controlled the state would be capable of anything. It is an enormous apparatus for advancing interests. Even the slave laborer understood that unemployment under a state would be more comfortable and secure. It would, however, be an exaggeration to say that the laborer worked solely because of force and violence. This is more or less the story of the birth of the city. Although it led to problems, as in the organization of exploitation and the powerful, it is clear that the city was a revolutionary step in the rational development of society. Aristotle considered a population of around 5,000 to be ideal for a city. When cities first emerged, their population were generally around that number. The city did, however, signal a new social composition, one that surpassed the tribal community. Urban citizenship unites those coming from different tribes and lineages. This shows how the city enriched society, how it was, at that point, a tool for development. It was not yet the source of any serious problems. Throughout antiquity, excluding some periods in Babylonia and Rome, there is no evidence of a city with a population problem. The social superiority of life in the city meant that it continuously grew more popular. As the Sumerian model spread, Egypt began to construct contained cities. Indeed, Egyptian civilization is unique in having been part urban and part peasant. Historians tell us that there were at least 10 villages for every city, but there was a symbiotic relationship between them, which meant that at this juncture there was not yet any problem between the city and the village. Nonetheless, trade and craftsmanship were highly developed. Roads, architecture, the arts, and palace structures, as well as other structures around the temple, expanded and reconfigured the city. Many cities were also built around military posts. Roman military posts in particular formed the nucleus of cities. Rome, the last magnificent city of the archaic age, probably carried within it all of the problems of its era. This made Rome alternately civilization's most magnificent and most problematic city. All classes and communities could be found in it: the aristocracy, the bourgeoisie, slaves, the lumpenproletariat, all of the different ethnic groups and races, and every belief system. The remnants of the old classes and communities and the embryo of the new ones were both present. It was also possible to note a range of morality and politics, and distinct styles of administration. Every form of monarchy, republic, and democracy was being experimented with somewhere in the empire. Both the remnants and the embryos of all of the different examples of science, the arts, philosophy, and religion were on display. Rome was a truly ecumenical city. This is another sense in which all roads lead to Rome was a reality. Rome represented the peak of the 3,500-year-old central civilization. Even its collapse reflected its magnificence. The two major forces that undermined Roman civilization were the Christians, who made up the poorer classes, and those groups that preserved strong ethnic characteristics. Referring to them as barbarians is to fall into the trap of civilization's terminology. They attacked in waves, one internally and the other externally, and would finally bring the city down. The year 476 CE not only marked the fall of the city, the fall of Rome, but also the decay, decline, and collapse of antiquity and the archaic age of civilization. At no point during the Middle Ages did civilization again attain the level of urbanization it achieved during antiquity. Initially, the cities, castles, and ramparts of the Middle Ages were relatively small and simple. The cities were little more than small emirates and feudal headquarters. They began to expand when craftspeople and palace servants first gathered around them. Although the merchant class provided the impetus for growth and greater magnificence, there were very few cities that could hold a candle to older cities such as Rome, Iskenderia, or Alexandria, Antakya, Antioch, Nusaybin and Dara and Urfa, or Edessa. They may have had larger populations, but in terms of architecture and amenities, temples, theaters, assembly halls, agoras, hippodromes, amphitheaters, public baths, sewage systems, workshops, and the like, they lacked the splendor of the old cities. The civilization of the Middle Ages was more makeshift, with its cities built on the ruins of antiquity and their archaic age. The life of the city in no way surpassed that of rural and village life. Cities were essentially islands in an ocean of villages. The cities were the site of power struggles and class conflict, but they did not yet pose an environmental threat. In general, the civilization system, in particular due to capital monopolies, eroded the environment gradually. For example, salination was the work of agricultural monopolies. This situation continued until the end of the 18th century, with the problems being increasingly aggravated. The real crisis of urbanization emerged with the 19th century Industrial Revolution. This was no coincidence, but was an aspect of the antisocial nature of industrialism. The primary responsibility for the ecological problems created by the city lies with its fundamental detachment from the environment. The village had a one-to-one relationship with the environment and recognized its total dependency on the environment and that it was, in fact, a product of the environment. It lived as if in a direct dialogue with the environment and the animals and plants, its common language being agriculture. Village society formation was heavily influenced by this language. The situation was quite the opposite in the city. The city gradually broke with agriculture and the environment. It developed a new language, the language of the city. It was based on a different rationale, and its attachment to environmental reason grew increasingly weak. The language of the city was more about trade, crafts, industry, and money, which constituted their reason and science, and was therefore ultimately constituted by them. This was a new dialectical development of language. Clearly, language and mentality are laden with contradictions and alienation. At this point, urbanization was the result of the interplay of the widespread dialects and cultures of the clans, tribes, ashirets, peoples, and village societies of both the old rural society and this new social system. This new system also gave rise to a distinctive science, arts, religion, and philosophy. From a class perspective, two other major categories came into being: the aristocracy and everyone else. The city dweller had not yet attained new and independent characteristics, remaining at this point little more than an extension of general society. The historical equilibrium was completely undermined in the 19th and 20th centuries. Obviously, this was not an abrupt development. The renewed rise of the city between the 10th and 16th centuries on the Italian peninsula denoted the spread of the commercial revolution from Italy to the rest of Europe, beginning in the late 13th century. The Italian cities led this process, attempting to replicate the growth of Rome. This resulted in intense inter- and intra-city competition, part of a struggle to gain leadership of this new phase of civilization. It was as if the old life had been revived, but the new conditions would inevitably transform that life. A new Rome could not be created by imitating the old one. That would only result in indistinct copies of Rome. Its attempt at establishing a central monarchy and the nation-state would not be successful either. Nonetheless, it is beyond dispute that the Italian cities of the Renaissance led European civilization during 10th through 16th centuries under the combined leadership of the Church and secular tendencies. The Hanseatic League launched the German urban revolution, with its constituent towns later undergoing their own commercial revolutions. The rise of manufacturing that was set in motion marks the second period, with an intense struggle against centralization based on the confederalism of the towns. The struggle and rebellions, involving many peasant and various semi-working class groups and craftspeople, lasted for around 400 years. After a bloody period, for a variety of reasons, these early experiences of town and rural democratic confederalism were defeated by the centralized monarchies and the arising nation-states. Had they not been defeated, the history of Europe would have been written differently. The current Federal Republic of Germany is going through a very slow evolutionary transformation from bourgeois nation-state fascism to this older model, but as bourgeois federalism rather than democratic confederalism. The real boom occurred in the towns in Netherlands and England. The fact that they had been the centers of three intense revolutions played a role. The commercial, financial, and industrial revolutions attained their true victories in Amsterdam and London. Communal federalism was easily suppressed in both of these countries, but this did not mean that all rural or urban people quickly succumbed to the center and the nation-state. It took the 16th and 17th century revolutions in Netherlands and England to accomplish this. Amsterdam was the leading city during the 17th and 18th centuries, while that honor fell to London in the 19th and 20th centuries. Both of these cities were world centers of this modern age. They administered the Central World Civilization system as hegemonic powers during this huge transformation, and as a result, both their population and their contradictions grew rapidly. It was during this period that the truly cancerous nature of the city began to become apparent. Its diseased structures were subsequently transported to France, the US, Eastern Europe, Russia, the Far East, Latin America, the Middle East, and Africa. The 20th century is the term where the city begins to gain the edge over the rural in history. The capitalist urban paradigm, alongside the old civilization, began to replace the paradigmatic world of communal rural society, which had played a key role for the previous 12,000 years. The city was no longer just the center for commerce, finance, and industry, but became the hegemonic center of a particular worldview. This new paradigm established itself through the universities and academic centers for science, as well as through hospitals and prisons, and the new class structure and ascendant bureaucracies, and tried to assert control over the old eschatological worldview, replacing it with strict positivism. In this sense, positivism became the new bourgeois religion. In the end, it found it more practical and effective to put on the mask of scientism and benefit from the extraordinary growth in the importance of the sciences. Society had truly grown cancerous because of the structure of these cities. Aristotle, for example, had never imagined a city with a population of 10,000 people. Cities have grown steadily in population from 100,000 to 1 million, to 5 million, to 15 million, to 20 million people. And now we can foresee cities with populations of 25 million or more. If this is not cancerous growth, then what is? Just feeding such a city could wipe out a mid-sized country and its surroundings in no time. Such growth is irrational and can only lead to the destruction of nature of society and the city, along with first nature. No country and its population can environmentally sustain such growth for very long. This cancerous growth is the fundamental basis of the current environmental destruction. The city occupies, invades, and destroys, and in the process essentially colonizes its country and its people. The city is the new colonial power, the center of global commerce, financial, and industrial monopolies, with its bases in the shopping malls. The fact that the security precautions taken in these shopping malls are in every way equivalent to the measures taken at the old castles and ramparts confirms this. 21st century imperialism and colonialism occur not outside, but inside countries. The colonizers are not foreigners, but more like their partners. It is not only capital monopolies that became global, but also power and the state. There is no longer a distinction between the inside and the outside of global power. They are all partners. Therefore, the nation they belong to is no longer of any importance. Making military, economic, and cultural distinctions has also become meaningless. English is their common language, and Anglo-Saxon culture the common culture. NATO, the military organization, and the UN, the international organization. There is no longer a single New York. The hegemonic center of the US that took over from London in the 1930s, but multiple New Yorks and Londons. We have arrived at the age of global cities. The cancerous growth of the cities in the global age, with their rapid spread, is not just destroying the environment. The mentality and way of life of urban dwellers would make even a Martian seem relatively earthly and less bizarre. The underdeveloped nobility of urban dwellers became obsolete before it was even born. It attempts to conceal its true monstrosity by presenting itself as modern and fashionable. The real barbarian, with its fascism, genocide, including unlimited cultural genocide and finally society-side, is no longer rural-based, but is city-based. It is indeed the city itself. All of the barbaric individuals and groups make us miss the old barbarians, although I do not in any way believe that the migrant tribes were actually barbarians. The Babylonians of the modern age are on the scene. The end of this age cannot be estimated, but all of the scientific data show that our planet cannot bear this world. Even if they were to retreat to rural areas, they are infected from head to toe. It is very important to understand that city society is wandering at the edge of society side. No doubt, class power and statist structures are responsible for the situation that has befallen the city. The incredible rentier from the city has turned city dwellers into merciless barbarians and created the city monster. City dwellers and society alone cannot be held responsible for this. Sometimes the innocent suffer along with the guilty. The slum dwellers, the new Christians of the city, must find a way out for themselves. Otherwise, they are condemned to face much worse conditions at the hands of thousands of Neros than anything a single Nero was responsible for. We should consider how to rescue the limited remaining beauty, morality, and reason in the city. Every social project needs to put the problems arising from urbanism, which long ago became a disease, at its center. We need to be aware that this is the only way we can hope to find meaningful solutions to all our current social and ecological problems. There's no need to look for other reasons for the approaching collapse of the world and society. Problems originating in the cities are already sufficient cause for concern. Society's class and bureaucracy problem. Those who view class division and bureaucracy as requirements for social existence may find this problematization odd. Some people may assert that class division and bureaucracy may cause certain problems, but as entities, they do not constitute a problem in and of themselves. However, these structures are as problematic as the city itself. Like the city, class division and bureaucracy may not have constituted much of a burden or problem during the initial stages of civilization, but their problematic nature has become more evident recently. Class division and the corresponding bureaucratization are problematic realities that do nothing to serve social morality and politics. Society has a long history of widespread opposition to these two developments, raising rigorous resistance and making their imposition less than easy. The diversity in social nature, which I will elaborate on in later sections, can vary greatly and attain new forms. This is normal and in keeping with the spirit of nature. Just like some tissues in plants and animal species that are underdeveloped and do not need to be developed, in the nature of society too, apart from quite limited temporary and functional classes and stratifications that would make variety and diversity meaningful and would be a component of them, extremely permanent, non-functional and useless classes and stratifications that penetrate the social fabric like a tumor are non-essential. The class-based development of the priest, the aristocracy, and the bourgeoisie that was to some degree useful for a while can be tolerated conditionally. However, these are the ideological, political, economic, and military hegemonic powers seen through the history of civilization. From the point of view of social morality and politics, it is impossible to accept them with their permanent excessively oppressive and exploitative characteristics. The contradiction is antagonistic from this point of view, because the very nature of class and bureaucracy amounts to a negation of social morality and politics. The condition I suggest is very important. A class and bureaucracy that is diverse or encourages diversity is certainly possible. For example, we cannot consider the temple, created by the Sumerian priestly class, completely dysfunctional. The priests laid the main foundation of science, efficient production, urbanism, religion, craftsmanship, and order. This is not unique. The priestly class played a similar role in the emergence of numerous cultures. Any conditional understanding shown to the priests must be understood in the light of their positive contributions. But the legitimacy of class and bureaucracy in their calcified, dysfunctional, and excessively overblown state is always controversial and must be overcome. Much the same is also true of the aristocracy. Aristocrats also made contributions to social development in various areas, including order, effective work, administrative elegance, the arts, and science. This framework creates a certain tolerance for the aristocracy. But the familiar calcification, despotism, dynasties and kingdoms, and even the deification of themselves are all a disease that cannot be accepted. Social morality and politics are antagonistic to these developments. A struggle to overcome them is required if true morality and politics are to emerge. All of this is even truer for the bourgeoisie. The development of this class and its bureaucratic apparatus has contributed to social development during revolutionary periods. Commerce and currency tools, like money and bonds, take the initiative in developing industry, periodically experimenting with democracy, and making limited contributions to science and the arts are aspects that we can tolerate. However, the excessively permanent structures of the bourgeoisie, which has led to more class division and bureaucratization over the last 400 years to a degree unsurpassed in the previous history of civilization, exacerbated their cancerous growth, making it larger in numbers and more dangerous than any other upper class. In my paradigm, the bourgeoisie and bureaucracy that occupy the center in history of class division act like a cancer. Social nature simply cannot sustain such class division and bureaucracy. If forced to do so, I would call it fascism. I believe that fascism expresses the ill intent of the middle class, the sum of bureaucracy and the bourgeoisie, toward society. What this indicates is that society and the middle class cannot coexist. Some intellectuals present the middle class as the class base of republican and democratic regimes. This projection is among liberalism's worst and falsest propaganda. The middle class has played the key role in the negation of the republic and democracy. Other classes play a more limited role and are generally unrelated to fascism. The middle class, with this particular feature, plays the same role as excessive urbanization, cancerous growth. And the tight organic and structural ties between the two should not be overlooked. The city acquires its disease from middle-class greed and growth, while such cities themselves inevitably foster the growth of middle class. The middle-class mental framework is positivist. This class has the most superficial structure, lacking essence and depth, and cannot, in fact, will not, see all aspects of a phenomena beyond evaluating them on the basis of self-interest. Although it presents positivism disguised as scientism, it is the most pagan class in history. For example, the number of commemorative statues has exploded under this class. In appearance, it is secular and worldly, but at its core, it is the most religious and impulsive power. The religious aspect in this case is its bigoted positivist beliefs and thoughts. We know that positivism never rests on the totality of truth. This class, rhetorically secular but essentially anti-secular, shamelessly imposes the most illusionary projects on society. It is the class that has developed capital's economic, political, military, ideological, and scientific monopoly at a global level, making it the most anti-society class. Its anti-society nature expresses itself in two ways: genocide and society-side. It was the bourgeois class character that made it possible to annihilate a people or community because of its descent, race, or religion. Society-side, however, is worse. It occurs in two ways. First, it imposes its nation-state ideology and the institutionalization of power as militarism and war, penetrating all of the nooks and crannies of society. This is an all-out war on society carried out by power amalgamated with the state. The bourgeoisie knows full well from experience that there is no other way for it to rule society. Second, virtual society, arising from the media and informatics revolution of the second half of the 20th century, has replaced genuine society. Or, more precisely, we have a form of media-hyped, computer-based bombardment warfare. In the last half-century, societies have been successfully ruled by this second form of warfare. When the imaginary, virtual, and simulacra society is substituted for genuine society, or is assumed to have been, it engages in society-side. I favor a different approach to the categories of slaves, serfs, and workers, the exploited and oppressed classes of history. Such class divisions have a limited role in determining the subject and in democratization, because they are completely within the intellectual and structural framework of their masters and have been turned into an insignificant extension or appendage. No class in history has ever become its own subject and toppled its masters. This reflects a very important reality. Even in the case of the oppressed and exploited, class divisions can be viewed as branches at varying distances from the trunk, society. No matter how much the branch droops, or even if it breaks off, it will not affect the trunk. Or when it does, its impact is limited. That is why terms like slave and master, serf and aristocrat, or worker and bourgeoisie, society, are faulty. Social sciences must develop new names and descriptions. Just as we cannot describe a tree by its branches, we cannot identify a society simply on the basis of the classes that have emerged within it. More importantly, as we have seen from many examples in the history of both real socialism and anarchism, subjectivizing, praising, and charging these classes of slave, serf, worker, and petit bourgeois with central revolutionary roles has not worked out all that well. As I see it, this is because this is very much the wrong role to give them. The correct approach is to oppose all class division. The slaves, serfs, and working class may indeed have played a positive, subjective, revolutionary role during transitional periods, but they too degenerated and became dysfunctional as they grew, became permanent, and reconciled with the upper classes. More importantly, a libertarian, egalitarian, and democratic worldview would not subjectivize or give moral and political value to either side of any class division, except in the instances I mentioned above. Such a worldview must struggle against class division and see it in contradiction with social nature and as anti-society, regardless of the classes involved. Just because the classes we mention have existed does not make them legitimate or representative of true social values. A tumor cannot be considered a normal part of the body, and we can see social phenomena in the same way. Besides, all of the oppressed and exploited lower classes have arisen as a result of the force and the hegemonic ideologies of power and the state. The slavery, serfdom, and labor that arose under those conditions can only be condemned. To say, "Long live the glorious worker, serf, and slave," is to objectively praise and approve the existing forces of hegemonic power. This approach to class by many schools of thought, including those of Marx and his successors, is the main reason for their failure. The upper classes may be meaningful to a certain degree, but because the classes that do the great bulk of labor with much blood and sweat were formed through violence and ideological persuasion, it is best to continuously condemn such class stratification, never praise it, and struggle to overcome it. Classes are given the honor of being agents for change when they cannot be, and although it is evident that they cannot make a revolution, they are given such a role, and as is frequently seen in the history of social struggles, they cannot escape being defeated. The reason for the defeat lies in a faulty understanding of the problem, and in attributing the wrong role to class stratification. The social struggles of the new era, the 21st century, will only be successful if they do not repeat this fundamental error. It is true that the bourgeoisie has aggravated the class problem. It is also true that its class interests have acceded to power. Acceding to power is effectively waging war on society, in every nook and cranny of society, and it has formalized this within the state, thereby reaching its most advanced stage. Under the aegis of capital partnership, it is abundantly clear that they have instrumentalized many social segments, concessionist workers in particular. The bourgeoisie has almost absorbed society. Even so, it is the most problematic class that has ever arisen, and it has vastly multiplied society's problems. Bureaucracy, the ruling class's institutional instrument of implementation throughout history, has become increasingly ubiquitous with the formation of the nation-state over the last 200 years, almost playing the role of an independent class and increasing its influence over power and the state. In fact, it can comfortably be said that it considers itself to be the state. It is hard to refute that it has become a primary power for caging society and has secured this role by seizing control of all social areas. In our present society, capitalist modernity, it is not only the state bureaucracy that has become monstrous, but the world of monopolies that follows in its footsteps. The monopolies are the result of a decision to become professionally managed companies rather than family businesses, massively increasing bureaucracies in this domain as well. This new reality of large corporations clearly contributes to the excessive growth of bureaucracy. In a certain sense, this is corporations becoming states. In reality, when nation-states prove inadequate, and the establishment of a new state form is on the agenda, there is an increasing tendency for global and local corporations to become more like states. The problems of society resulting from the grip of class and bureaucracy are the current reality. It is, so to speak, the now of all history. Furthermore, it can be said that this pair have social nature in the stranglehold of their octopus-like arms and dissolve it. The conclusion that we can draw is that we are going through the most chaotic and crisis-ridden period of history. Social freedom, equality, and democracy will only be possible in a system with a democratic civilization structure, and this, in turn, requires that we struggle to build it on the basis of a rectified science. Society's education and health problems. It may look like an unnecessary issue, but it is important to grasp the problems caused when the areas of education and health, as was the case for science, are monopolized by power and the state. Just as science that has become state science is the most effective tool for ideological hegemony, the same is true when education and health are integrated with power. Education can be defined as society's effort to pass on its experience in the form of theoretical and practical knowledge to its members, particularly its youth. Children's socialization is ensured by society's educational activities. Because children and the youth belong to society, their education is society's most important duty and not the duty of power and the state. It is both a right and a duty for society to raise children and youth according to its own traditions and social nature. This is vital, a question of survival. A society cannot share with another power its right to exist, and to this end, the duty to educate its youth, not even with the state or another apparatus of power. If it does, it will be surrendering itself to the ruling monopolies. The sacredness of the right to education stems from existence itself. No other power, including a child's parents, can be as close or feel the need to be as close to children and youth as society does. One of the most anti-society aspects of civilization throughout history is depriving society of its children and youth. The statist civilization system achieves this in one of two ways: either by annihilating the elders and enslaving the children and youth, or by educating them to make them useful to the upper levels of the ruling power. One of the most important purposes of war is to set up devshirme centers, where children and young women and men, as the most precious goods, can be assimilated. This is how the foundation of primitive bureaucracy is established. In a way, the history of civilization is the history of using this method both to weaken society and to constitute the power of the bureaucratic apparatuses, thereby establishing a society to counter society, the society of power and the state to counter natural society. In this establishment, children and youth who have been isolated from their own society are taught a completely different language, culture, and history. The fundamental goal of this education is to alienate children from their essence, and ideologically and materially inculcate them with the most statist identity possible, making it impossible for them to live without power. Power and the state are turned into the only valid framework of existence. Those recruited consider themselves to be power and the state, and thus are pitted against natural society. Sometimes state society and social nature are treated as equal. This is incorrect and contradictory, The history of civilization is built on this contradiction. These historical realities are the underlying reason for the ruler's seizure of education. Beyond that, they do not care about the task of education for society. Just as a capitalist educates his workers, rulers similarly educate those they dominate, as their servant workers. Even the members of the bureaucracy, from the highest to the lowest, are educated as servants. The nation-state powers in particular secure their monopoly of society's children and youth through education. Imbued with the ruler's historical perspective and understanding of the arts, as well as with their religious and philosophical mindsets, these children and youth are no longer members of their families, but are now the true children and goods of the rulers. This is how such profound alienation is institutionalized. The bourgeoisie is the class that has accomplished the most far-reaching monopoly over society in terms of education. When primary and secondary school were made compulsory, and those wishing to find a job were reminded that they needed a university degree, the clamps of alienation and dependency imposed on society's youth, as well as the process of being caged, became compulsory. Force, financial power, and education have become the irresistible weapons with which society is colonized. Throughout the history of civilization, education has been used to deliver the heaviest blow in the war that power and the state have waged against society. A society's right to education is one of the most difficult of its rights to accomplish. Society must control education if it is to secure its existence against the burgeoning nation-state and the economic monopolies. In this sense, society has entered the most difficult period of history. Ideological hegemony colonizes not only militarily and economically, but more recently is greatly facilitated by the communications revolution and the media war. Intensely focused and very surreptitious, waged against the whole of society, facilitating a more successful renewed cultural colonization. Society's only way to freedom and emancipation is to resist this cultural conquest and colonization with its most fundamental tools for existence, moral and political struggle. A society that has lost its youth, or inversely, a youth that has lost its society, is beyond defeated. It has lost and betrayed its right to existence. Decay, disintegration, and annihilation will follow. The fundamental duty of society in response to this is to develop its own educational institutions as the main tools for securing its existence. Revolution of meaning will be successful when society's educational institutions interpret scientific, philosophical, artistic, and linguistic content in a way that removes them from the alliance of the science power structures. Otherwise, there will be no way of ensuring that society's moral and political fabric functions. Therefore, while addressing the question of education requires moral and political institutions, a true objective of morality and politics is social education. A society that fails to educate itself will be unable to develop and sustain its own morality and political organization, and such a society cannot avoid constant danger, decay, and even disintegration. The health of members of society is also an issue every bit as important as education. The foundation, existence, and freedom of a society that lacks the means to sustain the health of its members is at risk, if not already lost. Dependency in the field of health is a sign of overall dependency, whereas a society that can address the physical and psychological problems of its members autonomously has what it takes to achieve its freedom. The health problems that swept through colonized societies are linked to the colonial regimes they live under. Establishing health institutions and training specialists must be seen as both a fundamental right and an essential duty of society. Power and the state strip society of this duty and monopolize it. This is a huge blow to social health. To struggle for the right to health is to respect yourself and understand the essence of freedom. In capitalist modernity, nation-state control of education and health is considered vital. Without taking control of these two fields, upon which society's existential, healthy, and open-minded development depends, and constructing monopolistic domination over them, it is extremely difficult to maintain an overall hegemony and exploitation. Control of education and health is extraordinarily important to the monopolies, since they understand that they cannot make society their property by military force alone. Once again, we see that the monopolistic power and state lies at the heart of all society's existential problems. Profit and capital cannot be sustained without the power of monopoly. It is equally true, however, that without a systemic struggle for a democratic civilization, none of society's problems can be permanently resolved. Society's militarism problem. Militarism is the most advanced form of antisocial monopolism. It is not unrealistic to assume that the initial effort to establish authority over social nature, to oppress and exploit people, was the result of the analytical thought and action of a crafty strongman from a hunting tradition. Essentially, he attempted to establish his authority over two key groups: the hunter at his side and the woman he was trying to confine to the home. Along the way, as shamans and gerontocratic elements joined the crafty strongman, the first hierarchical authority was formed in many societies in various forms. With the transition to civilization, the crafty strongman and his entourage institutionalized themselves as the military arm of the state. The three successive dynasties of Ur that followed in the immediate wake of the priest-king period of Sumerian society reflect this development, and many other communities had parallel experiences. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, it is possible to follow step by step the way the kingdom was clearly detached from the goddess Inanna tradition, and the way priestesses were weakened and confined to houses. If we see Gilgamesh as symbolic of the first commander in history, we can better analyze the rise of the militarist tradition. This tradition's task was to hunt down people to meet the city's needs for slaves. With the help of the collaborationist Enkidu, who is mentioned in the Epic of Gilgamesh, they hunted the so-called wild barbarian tribes living in the north of present-day Iraq. It is obvious that the tyranny of the city was the real source of barbarism and savagery. The word barbaric, in the Greek cultural tradition, was developed by the city as diversionary propaganda and a lie to establish ideological superiority. The rural tribes, which were weak and disorganized compared to the city, could not have been barbaric in the sense that official society claimed. The concept of barbarism is one of the most important diversionary lies in the history of civilization. The second task of the town bully was security. To this end, the most common method was to erect castles and ramparts and develop ever more powerful and deadly weapons. To do so, millions of people were enslaved, turned into serfs, or proletarianized, with those who did not accept their new status being killed, and undeniably all of this has been mirrored as history to us. In keeping with this power, the military appropriated for itself the largest share of the economic value extorted, as is clear from the many historical expeditions with no other purpose than plundering. Furthermore, property was the basis of the state, and military conquest and seizure was clearly the source of property. Whoever conquered it owned it, declaring this to be a natural, inalienable right. This is the sum of property and plunder that has been conquered and seized by the forces of power and the state. The principle that all Ottoman land and people are the sultan's, for example, is nothing other than the continuation of this foundational tradition concerning the relationship between the state and military expeditions. Tradition was established in this way and sanctioned in every newly built state. This is why the military sees itself as the true custodian of the state, and thus of property. And in defining itself as such, it takes this historical tradition into consideration. The fact that it is the strongest arm of the monopoly accords with the nature of power and the state. Indeed, the human power and weaponry it possesses was sufficient to achieve its goals. In this light, the fact that military coups are the response to the occasional efforts of the civil bureaucracy to increase its share of the monopoly is hardly surprising. The role of ideological and bureaucratic monopolies, also called the ilmiya and kalamiya classes, in the establishment of power and the state, was unquestionably indispensable, but not as decisive as the role of the military. Even the most superficial examination of past and present power and state apparatuses confirms this. First, what really matters for our purposes is that the military is the most advanced and decisive monopoly. The soldier and the army are not a source of glory, honor, and heroism, but are an essential element of the monopoly of power. Their essence is economic. The army relies on the economy. It positions itself over it and at a distance from it, but at the same time takes the steps necessary to guarantee its income above all else. It is the monopoly sector that is the most difficult to oppose, and the one that all other segments of the monopoly must compromise and share surplus value with. A practice that has an extensive historical basis and is, as such, a deep-rooted institutional tradition. In essence, it is the monopoly of the class that is most closely interested in economic development, but feels the most pressing need to keep its distance. To achieve this, it projects an image of itself as the power that is most remote from society, while in reality, it is the monopolistic sector that has equipped itself with the most advanced economic and military weapons. Without a correct analysis of the military, we can neither fully understand what economic monopolism or power and state monopolisms are. The three of them comprise a whole. They feed on the same substance, the surplus values of society. In exchange, they claim that they take care of society's security, education, health, and productivity. This is how statism, the ideological state, presents itself. But this is not the truth. The truth is just as we described it. The military is the most sharply organized arm of capital power. Thus, it follows that it is the institution that ultimately subjugates and cages society. The military has always been the power that has penetrated, controlled, and subjugated society, regardless of the form of state. But it reached its apex in the era of the middle class and under nation-state monopoly. The defining characteristic of the nation-state is that in the name of creating an official army, the rest of society was officially disarmed, and the monopoly on arms was transferred to the state and the army. At no time in history was society as disarmed as it has been under bourgeois rule. The reason for this extremely important development is the intensification of exploitation and the resultant rise of far-reaching resistance. Society cannot be ruled if it is not thoroughly and continuously disarmed, opened up to the infiltration of power, and subjected to constant surveillance. Society cannot be dealt with unless it is confined in the iron cage of modernity. In addition, society cannot be ruled if it is not confined and besieged by the media army of the global monopolistic financial age. Formation of the ideological media monopolies, as well as the bureaucratic military monopolies, replicates the aspects of exploitation monopolies. Not only are they inseparably bound together, they also condition each other. The most recent major central civilization, the superhegemon, together with other regional hegemons, including all of their local collaborators, is based on militarism and gigantic arms industry, both above and within society. The priority given to this monopoly over any other stems from its historical and current position. In this light, identification of militarism with the fascism of capitalist monopoly makes perfect sense. Of course, during the era of natural society, and throughout written history, various forms of society have engaged in wholesale self-defense against the militarist evolution of civilization, developing a variety of forms of resistance and engaging in numerous uprisings, participating in institutionalized guerrilla and people's defense armies, and waging great defensive wars, all based on the tradition of self-defense. Of course, defensive wars and militarist monopoly wars are not equivalent. There is a difference in both quality and essence. While one is anti-society, colonialist, corrupting and destructive, the other favors and protects society and strives to free society's moral and political capacity. Democratic civilization protects and defends society, engaging in systematic self-defense against the central civilization's militarism. Society's peace and democracy problem. Under the previous 11 headings, I tried to briefly describe the problems plaguing social nature. Any paradigm or social science will only be of use if it is based on an analysis that takes into consideration the issues raised here and develops responses. Otherwise, there will be nothing to distinguish it from traditional or liberal rhetoric. The general conclusion I have reached is that the source of social problems lies in the combined effect, domination, and colonization of the oppressive and exploitative monopolies. They exploit social nature, and in particular, the economic resources that generate surplus value. The problems do not arise from nature or any social factor. Societies cannot survive without social morality and politics, which are factors necessary to their existence and for addressing society's common affairs. The natural state of society, its existence, cannot be immoral and apolitical. If a society's moral and political fabric has not properly developed or has been undermined, distorted, and paralyzed, then it can be argued that society is occupied and colonized by various monopolies, capital power and the state among them. To sustain this sort of life is a betrayal of and alienation from its own existence. It is to exist like a herd, like goods, commodities, and possessions under monopoly domination. Under these conditions, society has lost the natural essence and proficiency of a natural society or become obsolete. Such a society has been colonized, or even worse, has become property in every way, leaving itself to decay and poverty. There are numerous societies that fit this definition, both historically and currently. Those that have decayed and been annihilated far outnumber the survivors. When a society can no longer create and run institutions that provide meaningful moral and political guidance, that society has succumbed to oppression and exploitation. It is in a state of war. It is possible to define history as a state of war waged by civilizations against society. When morality and politics are dysfunctional, there is only one path to open a society: self-defense. A state of war is nothing more than the absence of peace. As such, only self-defense will make peace possible. A peace with no self-defense can only be an expression of submission and slavery. Liberalism today imposes on societies and peoples peace with no self-defense. The unilateral game of democratic stability and reconciliation is nothing but a fig leaf on the bourgeois class domination achieved by the armed forces. It is nothing but a covert state of war. The major plank in capitalist ideological hegemony is the idea that a true peace is a peace that requires no self-defense. Sacred concepts have been used throughout history to express this idea. Religions, in particular civilized religions, overflow with an abundance of such concepts. Peace is only possible and meaningful if society can defend itself and protect its moral and political character. Peace, particularly the peace that Michel Foucault worked so hard to define, could in this way acquire an acceptable social expression. Peace understood in any other way is nothing but a trap and an implicit state of war on all peoples and communities. In capitalist modernity, the word peace abounds with pitfalls. Using the word without correctly defining it has many drawbacks. Let us redefine peace. Peace is neither the complete elimination of the state of war, nor stability or the absence of war under the supremacy of one party. There are different parties to any peace, and the complete dominance of one party over another does not and cannot denote peace. Furthermore, weapons will fall silent only when there is acceptance of the functioning of society's moral and political institutions. The three conditions mentioned immediately above must be met for principled peace. Any other peace would be meaningless. Let's elaborate on these conditions. First, a complete disarmament of the different parties is not on the table, but the conflicting parties must vow not to attack one another regardless of the dispute. Military superiority will not be pursued. All sides must accept and respect the right of the other to maintain the means necessary to ensure its security. Second, the ultimate superiority of one party over the other is not at stake. While it is possible to achieve stability and quiescence under the rule of the gun, this cannot be called peace. Peace is only on the agenda when all sides agree to stop the war without one of the parties achieving armed superiority, regardless of whether they are right or wrong. Third, again, regardless of the positions of the various sides, they agree to respect the moral and political institutions of society when addressing the problems underlying the conflict. This is the framework of what we call a political solution. A ceasefire that does not include a moral and political solution cannot be called peace. Democratic politics is a central issue for principled peace. When society's moral and political institutions are functioning, the natural outcome is the process of democratic politics. Those who want peace must understand that peace can only be attained if politics based on morality play a part. To attain peace, it is essential that at least one side acts on the basis of democratic politics. Otherwise, the sole result will be a peace game played in the interest of the monopolies. In that situation, democratic politics plays a vital role. Only dialogue among democratic forces can stand up to power and the state forces and achieve a meaningful peace process. Without such a peace, even if the warring parties, or monopolies, silence the weapons for a time, the state of war continues. Of course, there is war fatigue and economic difficulties arising from logistical needs, but as long as these difficulties can be resolved, the war will continue until one side attains unchallenged superiority. The silencing of weapons in this context cannot be called peace, but rather a ceasefire that portends a fiercer war to come. For a ceasefire to lead to genuine peace, the three conditions we have outlined must be met. On occasion, the side engaged in self-defense may attain conclusive superiority. This doesn't change the three conditions for peace. As was seen with real socialism and many legitimate national liberation struggles, immediately establishing your own rule and state to secure stability cannot be called peace. This is just replacing an external monopolistic force with an internal force, state capitalism, or a national bourgeois. Calling it socialism does not change the basic sociological reality. A principled peace is not something that can be attained by the superiority of power and the state. If power and the state, whatever they call themselves, do not share their advantages with the democratic forces, then peace will not be on the agenda. In the final analysis, peace is the conditional reconciliation of democracy and the state. History overflows with stories of the many attempts at such conditional reconciliations. There have been principled examples that have endured, and others that have collapsed before the ink dried on the treaty. Societies do not only consist of the establishment of power and the state. No matter what restrictions are placed on society, unless it is completely annihilated, it will continue to live, in keeping with its own moral and political identity. Although not a focus of written history, this is the essential reality of life. Society should not be seen as a narrative about power and the state. On the contrary, seeing society as the decisive nature would contribute to the formation of a more realistic social science. No matter how big or wealthy power and states may become, including capital monopolies, or their present-day beast-like heirs, they can never eliminate society. Because, in the final analysis, it is society that determines them, and those who are determined can never replace those who determine them. Even the present rulers' spectacular and unsurpassed media propaganda cannot obscure this fact. At the end of the day, they are the most miserable and pitiful of forces playing at being giants. In contrast, human society cannot be stripped of its meaning as the most wonderful creation of nature. The system of democratic civilization, our main paradigm, is a system in which society, both in its historical and present form, is interpreted, scientifically explained, and reconstructed. That is the subject matter of our next chapter.